Ready.
Well, welcome to the 23rd episode of Ideas and Lives. We're in our second year now, and Tzvi, Bodhi, and I are pleased to be here. We have a very special guest who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, Tzvi, introduce yourself.
All right. Well, for today, we're going to have to refer to me as Dr. Bodhi or Professor Bodhi, because our guest is also named Tzvi. And we're going to refer to him as Rabbi Marx.
Well, yes, well, we're delighted to welcome Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Marx. An
All
old
right,
friend.
now you got me confused. You threw in doctor. That.
Well, we'll shorten it to just Rabbi Marx.
Okay.
But his name is Tzvi, and we've known each other for a number of years, and we can get back to that. But welcome, Tzvi.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here again.
We're going to review, as we do, both the arc of people's careers and how they evolved and how their ideas evolved, and then their perspectives on certain issues. And so, Tzvi, let's get started with...
You're already violating rule number 1.
Go on.
His name is Rabbi Marx.
Oh, okay. Rabbi Marx, let us know where you grew up and where you were born and how that came to be.
Well, I was a war baby. I was born in Montpellier, France in 1942, in January 1942. And within, it was a kind of a relative safe haven under the Vichy government, because it was governed, the southern part of France was governed by the French, by Marshal Pétain. And the Germans, the Nazis, they administered the northern half. But about 11 months later, in December, they changed it, and the Germans took over directly for the administration of all of France. And at that point, my father very daringly found a hole in the fence on the border between France, there was somewhere around Grenoble, apparently, which is parallel to Lausanne in Switzerland. He found a hole in the fence, serendipity. Wasn't sure if it was a plant, if it was really a coincidence. He decided on January 1st of 1943, on the assumption that the German soldiers would be more drunk than usual, to take his family, that is my brother, my older brother, my mother, myself, and go and escape from France to Switzerland, which they did. And they came to Switzerland successfully, were picked up by the police, and were located in a refugee camp. And eventually my father made contact with the Jewish community. He himself was a cantor and a teacher. And the rest of the war we spent in Luxembourg, in Switzerland. After the war, they returned to Luxembourg, which is the birthplace and where my parents lived before they fled to France with the invasion of the Nazis in Luxembourg in 1940. And then 3 years later, they immigrated to New York City. I was then 6 years old. Within a few years, by the time I was 9, without going into the details, I and my 2 brothers, I have an older and a younger brother, were located in a yeshiva, one of the oldest yeshivas of New York City, the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School. And from there, through high school, I graduated that yeshiva. And from there, I went to Yeshiva University.
Well, what language was your native language?
My original native language was French. But at the age of 6, by the time I was 6 and a half, it was English. So
okay.
in that, my father spoke English fairly well because he had worked for the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation agency that were rehabilitating children from the concentration camps. He knew English pretty well. So we mostly spoke English at home, but I also heard Luxembourgish, not much Yiddish, though my mother spoke Yiddish from house. She came from Vienna. And I studied in the yeshiva. They had a track, Ivrit be'Ivrit, Hebrew. So it means you read the text in Hebrew and you translated and explained them in Hebrew. That's how I learned Hebrew. They had another track, Ivrit to Yiddish. So people read the text in Hebrew and went to Yiddish. But I stuck with the Hebrew and went to Yeshiva University, where eventually I majored in mathematics and psychology, and then eventually went into the ordination program, the smicha program for the Rabbanut. And I got smicha from
And how did
Rabbi
you,
Soloveitchik.
let's hear how you decided to go from math and to become a rabbi.
And which brand of Judaism?
Well, the Yeshiva University is Orthodox Judaism, so it was that branch. It also suited me. But your question, how did I go from math to Rabbanut? And it's an interesting personal story here that's very important. It was, in fact, a life-changing period. When I graduated Yeshiva University in math, I was accepted to their graduate school of math, the Belfer Graduate School of Math, also in Washington Heights. And I was meant to study mathematics, but with the 5 courses in math, algebra, linear topography, the calculus, and so on, I found myself studying more the philosophy of math rather than the math. And I found that the math didn't interest me, the philosophy did. So I realized that I was never going to be a mathematician. So I dropped out in the middle of that semester even, and decided, what should I do with my life? At that time, if you remember, under President Kennedy, they had the Peace Corps, where Americans would go abroad and help the world, save the world. So I joined the Peace Corps, and I was waiting to go to India, but I had to learn Hindi for that purpose. So I had to wait a few months. In the meantime, I was asked by the Yeshiva University Community Service Division if I would like to attend a new seminar for youth in London, Ontario. And they needed a music person. I was a music person because I played the guitar and the piano and I knew a lot of songs. So I went to that seminar. I'd never been to Canada. Who was a guest speaker there, the scholar? None other than Rabbi David Hartman, who was then a rabbi in Montreal. He was a fascinating lecturer, bright. He was also a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik, also from Lakewood Yeshiva, which is the classical queen yeshiva of the graduates of the yeshiva world. And in the course of the time of the seminar, he said to me, what are your plans? I said, my plans are to go to the Peace Corps. He said to me, how would you like to go to the Jewish Peace Corps? I said, the Jewish Peace Corps, what's that? He said, well, I'm looking for a youth director in my synagogue in Montreal and a Hebrew school teacher. And would you like to take that job? I thought for a minute and I said, I'll do it on 2 conditions. What are the 2 conditions? 1, I'll only come to Montreal if you study with me one-on-one twice a week. Personal mentorship. And the second is, you have to come to New York to speak to my father and persuade him that I'm not crazy, that I've been changing my mind so many times, they'll think I'm off, I'm off on the deep end somewhere. He kept his word. He came to New York, spoke to my father, and promised that he would keep an eye on me, not let me wander. And I went to Montreal there and became his disciple. Everything he did, I was in his tracks, following, lecturing at the university, into religious groups, children's groups, day school, synagogue activities. And I was the youth director. I learned how to create creative youth activities for the shul, like the Freedom March. At that time, Freedom Marches were big. In America, I wanted to have a Freedom March for Pesach in the streets of Montreal. But the board of the synagogue thought that was a little bit extravagant. They were scared. So they called on Rabbi Hartman to tone me down, and he persuaded me to do the Freedom March in the gymnasium. which was a much smaller scale peace march. But his example inspired me to realize this is something I would like to do, to be a rabbi. This kind of a rabbi I could be. And so then I went back to Yeshiva University, to the rabbinic program, in the REITs program, the Yitzhak Elchanan Yeshiva program, for 3 years. And I had a wonderful 3 years with very good chavrutot, that study partners. And I had one of the years I had with Rabbi Soloveitchik, and I continued to study with him even after I became a rabbi in a pulpit with Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg as the senior rabbi in Riverdale. That was my first year as a rabbi. So I had the benefit of David Hartman, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg. After which, that year of being a rabbi, I decided to become a teacher in the open school, the SAR Academy, Salanta Akiva Riverdale Hebrew Academy in Riverdale, New York, which meant a school without walls. So that was an interesting experiment, also sponsored by Yitzhak Greenberg and others. After a year of
that was before there was Zoom. How did you do it?
Long before Zoom. This is all experimental. I even made a movie on the tractate Bava Metzia with my class, my 7th graders. I wanted to get them interested in learning the intricacies of guardianship, the Arba Shomin, the 4 guardians, the responsibilities. So in order to get them to learn these legal texts, I said, let's make a movie. We'll make a script. You'll write the script, which means they have to study the text. We'll film it, and we'll have a movie. And we did. Things like that. So that was exciting year of education for me, learning how to be a teacher. But then I was offered a job to be the rabbi in Peekskill, New York. The president of the Peekskill Synagogue happened to be a student of David Hartman, when Rabbi Hartman in his early career was the rabbi in the Bronx. He was looking for a new rabbi for his synagogue. The other rabbi had been fired or left. And he asked Rabbi Hartman if he could recommend anybody. So Rabbi Hartman recommended me. Oh, so I get invited to become a rabbi in Peekskill. Now, peculiarly, Peekskill had 2 synagogues under one roof, under one board of directors, the Orthodox branch and the conservative branch. And that's a story in itself. But be that as it may, when I was interviewed, there were 10 interviews. I was the only Orthodox rabbi being interviewed for this conservative Orthodox shul. The other 9 were all conservative rabbis. And they asked me, what do you think of Hebrew school education? Meaning they thought that I should, be in charge of it somehow. I said to them, it's horrible. The only thing the students get out of it is they hate Judaism because they want to go play football. They don't want to come after public school to sit in a Hebrew school. If it was up to me, I would eliminate the Hebrew school and I would create weekends of enjoyment of Jewish living in the course of the year and maybe a summer camp. I thought they surely wouldn't hire me after that. But you know what? They hired me. and then I spent the next 5 years, wonderful years, learning how to become a rabbi in a small community. You see, in New York City, you can only specialize in one thing because there are so many rabbis. But in a small community, you have to be everything: the ambassador to the non-Jews. You have to be the coach for families in trouble. You have to give sermons. You have to do liturgy. And so
what about
it was wonderful.
Music too.
Also, well, I had a cantor who was so great. And this was also strange. Usually the cantors and the rabbis have a lot of tension. This cantor and I became the best of friends. You know why? He knew what I could do and I knew what he could do. We had wonderful, wonderful experiences together, including the marriage encounter years. I don't know if you know what that was. These were programs that came about to help married couples communicate with each other better. So anyway, without going into all the details, I became a marriage encounter rabbi. And as a result of that, a lot of young couples came to this synagogue in Northwest Chester County because they wanted that kind of service. So you would have, for example, a Friday night service, a woman would get up, how I felt when I baked my first challah, and the emotions I felt when I lit the candles. And I felt as if my grandfather was coming back to bless me. And we'd get these kind of sermons, and a lot of hugging and kissing. And the
Now,
older people in the
how
shul,
old were you? How old were you?
I was at that time 20, let me see, 28, I think, 27,
And
28.
you were married.
I was married. I
Oh,
had
you
2
were
kids.
married.
Yeah, because marriage encounters for people that are married. Yes, surely. And so the shul population doubled in size. Everybody became encountered. The older members couldn't understand, what are all these people hugging each other for? What is this here? Anyway, that marriage encounter was I had a marriage encounter principle for the Hebrew school. Everybody was open about their feelings, and we had nice attendance
That
to the
was the
services.
1960s, huh?
This is 1970. This is 1972 to 76. That's the years. And then suddenly in that year, 1976, in June, I think, or May, I get a call from David Hartman, who had made Aliyah to Israel. He says, Tzvi, I'm opening an institute to study the problem of how to do Judaism when the Jews have regained political power. Would you like to be part of that project? I said, give me 3 days to think about it, and then I'll let you know. Now, both I and my wife, Olav Sholem, Bobby, we were both Bnei Akiva members in our youths. We were all Zionist-oriented. My father was also Zionist-oriented. We had looked for an opportunity to make Aliyah. We had tried a kibbutz once, realized it was not for us, but we agreed that this would be a great opportunity. Our oldest son was just 6 years old. It would be the perfect time to make Aliyah. The youngest son was then 2 years old. Figured this is a good chance. So I said to Rabbi Hartman, tell me, what can you offer me by way of economic support? He said, I can give you a stipend of $5,000 for the year, not for the month. I said, okay. I think I was making something like 30,000 plus in Peekskill at the time. I had the house and cars. I said, okay, because I was a real idealist, you have to say, in such a situation. And we made Aliyah. We went to Israel in August 31st, 1976. And then began a whole new phase of my life and the family's life. Everything I had ever preached about on Judaism suddenly was turned on its head. I thought that as being a Jew, we are automatically more compassionate. It turned out that wasn't necessarily so. And it was a big disappointment, I must tell you.
Well, we had on this program a few sessions ago, Tamar
Frankel.
Tamar
Frankel.
Tamar Frankel, and he has some wonderful stories about Jews helping Jews in the early days of first Palestine and then Israel, about a bus that she was.
This is the 1920s and 30s. Okay.
Yeah, you're talking about a different
even
period.
into the 40s.
She's 97 years old.
Even into
You're
the
right.
40s.
Oh, these are the stories that we hear, and we dance, we did the whole, and this is what I preached in the synagogue. But the reality of Israel in 1976 and further was quite different. There were wonderful people that did great things. I knew them myself also, so I know it. But at the same time, we're like every other people. There's wife beating, there's robbery, there's murder, there's indifference, there's brusqueness. This is a different culture.
Where were you living? Where did you
I was living in Jerusalem, in Baka. Now, I was part of the Hartman Institute, the original Hartman Institute, and was tremendously motivated because David Hartman, selected around himself young scholars like Noam Zohar, Tzvi Zohar, Yisrael Knoll, people who later became professors now, and they're setting the pace in Jewish studies. But these were then young scholars, and we were exploring this question that most people didn't understand. What should Judaism be like when it is the majority? Because till now, for 1800 years or 1900 years, Jews have been living as a minority and trying to survive as a minority. And then the synagogue is the central institute, the central institute of such a life. For 1800 years, we practiced that paradigm, surviving as a minority around the synagogue, around the Beit Midrash, around the burial society, around the Gemilut Chesed societies, around holidays, kashrut, nida, children, education. Suddenly, we're political power with an army, with agriculture, with technology, and Jews living together who don't agree with each other. In the diaspora, the Jews that didn't agree with each other had separate shuls: Reform, Conservative, Renewal, Orthodox, Hasidic, Neo-Orthodox, whatever you like. They never had to meet each other. They never had to share their resources. No one forced them to. The American or European democracies protected the right to practice your religion as you wanted. In Israel, all these groups were living in the same space. They had to share budgets, space, broadcast time. They had to argue about identity, and they didn't agree with each other on the most fundamental things. Mostly, Israel is officially a secular society. The laws of Israel are from the Knesset, whereas the Jewish religious population, whether it's Orthodox or conservative or even Reform, that religion is different. And so the official rabbinate had the power of the budget. And these other groups were trying to find, make space for themselves to exist, which to this day is an issue. But I was concerned about the ethical part of Israel. Suddenly we had enemies. How do you treat enemies? What kind of a police force do you have? How do you is a Jewish police force different than a police force in Manhattan? And you find out that not necessarily. There's the same kind of protection, the same kind of misuse of power is possible, the same kind of issues that all human beings have. And so my dream about being a Jew had to change radically. And suddenly the old dream disappeared. For a while there was a nightmare, and suddenly a new dream appeared. And I have to say, the new dream was comprised of the experiencing of the wonderful commitment of some great people in Israel that made Israel possible, and the acceptance of the fact that the Jews are a work in progress and that they have to develop a new paradigm, which we're not there yet, because the old paradigm that Israel is a synagogue instead of being a country still pertains for many, many people. They're still disappointed when someone in Tel Aviv doesn't know where the shul is. How could he not know where the shul is? He's not Jewish. No, you don't have to know where the shul is when you live in Tel Aviv. You could speak Hebrew. You could even celebrate the holidays in a different way, agriculturally, family-wise, but still not know where the shul is. You don't have to go to shul. Your Jewish identity is not dependent on it. You serve in the army. Suddenly the army is the new vehicle of bondedness, plus the new hero types. Who are the new hero types? Not the Talmud Chacham, not the scholar necessarily, but the scientist, the military leader, the initiator, the one with chutzpah. It was a whole new undertaking. And the energy, my God, the energy was formidable. There's nothing to compare to it. So it was like you had to learn to digest this. And I did. I served in the army for 13 years as a lecturer. I was a martzeh, in K'tzin Chinuch Hashi, they call it. There's an education corps in the army. And I lectured to soldiers even in the first war in Lebanon. I was in Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, lecturing to soldiers in the front, 5 kilometers from the front line of the war there. I was lecturing to them on Zionism and Judaism. Unbelievable.
How long did you live in Israel, and how
I
did
lived
your
there
wife?
From 1976 to 1996, I lived in Israel. Then I emigrated
20
to Holland.
years.
I was divorced. I was divorced in Israel.
So, Tzvi, tell a few more stories about the army, especially.
Well, the army is like this. The army is like this. So they flew us to Lebanon, and we arrived on a Friday. I was with 8 other people. We drove to Lebanon at the beginning of that war. We drove to Lebanon when the Christians still liked the Israelis. at the beginning of the war. And we landed in a camp. There was nothing set up yet because the old group went away. So we had to sleep outdoors. So the commandant of the group comes to me. He says, Marx, lecturer, what do you lecture on? I said, me? I lecture on sex and the Bible. I said, oh, can you give us a lecture on Motzei Shabbos? They didn't have television yet. He needed a program. We didn't have television yet to entertain the soldiers. I said, okay. So comes Motzei Shabbos. Even the rabbi came to that lecture. Sex and the Bible, you know? In other words, you had to be creative in the army to get them even to be interested to want to hear a lecture. So nobody told you what to do, actually. You had to kind of promote yourself. So one time I remember I was on Yom HaShoah. Before Yom HaShoah, we prepared the soldiers for a theme. So I was on Har HaHor, that's up in the Golan. It's the highest point where they have a camp that overlooks Damascus. I had to be there for Yom HaShoah. So I have to give a lecture at 8 o'clock at night. The soldiers are dead tired. And they don't want to hear a lecture, but I have to give a lecture. So I said, look, you, where are you from? Where's your family from? Oh, Morocco. You can go back to sleep, I say. Shoah has nothing to do with you. Go back to sleep. I kicked the next day. Where's your family from? Algeria. You can go back to sleep. Nothing to do with you. Where's your family? Libya. I kicked them all. Nothing to do with you, to Shoah. They started to protest. What do you mean it has nothing to do with us? I have family that was in the Shoah. Come on, give me a break. Then turns out, of course, the Libyans had turned Jews over to the Italians, who turned them over to the Germans. So they were even victims from Libya. But anyway, I kicked them into awakeness by insulting them that they had nothing to do with the Shoah. For example, now, nobody told me to do it that way, but what can I do? This was an opportunity. Or I had a group of soldiers, women soldiers who had to be teachers. And I had to give them a lecture about Pesach, about the most boring lecture that these secular teachers would want to hear. The commandant comes and says, oh, Hine, Tzvi Marx, Tzvi, here's your lecture. I said, thank you very much. That's the introduction they give you. They don't warm the audience up at all, you know. Here's your lecturer. He leaves. I looked at these soldiers and I said to them, these are all women. I said, look, let me ask you something. Tell me the truth, I said. You're not interested in this subject, right? It's very boring, right? I said, I'm not going to tell. Just be honest. Yes. I said, so we don't have to do it. I said, if you don't tell, I won't tell. We don't have to do it. So I said, so what should we do? We have 3 hours here. They said, let's talk. One of them said, let's talk about revolution. I said, okay, that sounds interesting. Give me an example of a revolution. So they start the French Revolution, okay? Then they bring the American Revolution. Then they bring the Maccabees, the revolution. I said, so let me ask you something. Which revolution would you compare Pesach Revolution to when they revolted against the Egyptians? Is it like the French Revolution? Or is it like Hanukkah, the Maccabees? Or is it like the American? Well, they started to think. I said, after all, they didn't do anything. They had a barbecue. God did all the fighting. So it wasn't that kind of a revolution after all. Oh, never thought of it that way. Before you know it, we were talking about Pesach. That was the subject. That was the subject. And we had a great time. These are examples. In the 13 years, I got to lecture to every level of the Israeli army, Navy, infantry, mechanics, officers, the plain soldiers in the north, in the Golan, in Eilat, there was a Beit Chayal in Bethlehem. Often they did programs there. Sometimes they would bring the soldiers to the institute where I worked, and we give them a program there. It's because you had to do 45 days in the year, but you didn't do it consecutively. It was broken up over the year. So that made me realize how much we owe to these young people, that we exist. A new love happened in me for the Jewish reality, which I would never have understood by being a rabbi in the diaspora.
Now you were 13 years working for the army,
In-
but
in
you
the- in the- yeah.
but you were in Israel for 20 years. So what were the
No,
other side?
no, listen, when you say, well, I didn't work for the army, I did reserve duty. I worked for the Hartman Institute. This
Okay.
is what you do miluim. I wasn't
Okay.
working for the army. It's a miluim. It
And you
was
did that for 13 years, but
and the
you
period
were
of-
in Israel for 20 years.
yes, from
And the whole
exactly.
time at the Hartman Institute?
I was at the Hartman Institute from the beginning until the end, till the 20 years, till I left. Exactly.
What were
That was
some of the
my-
highlights at Hartman for you?
The Hartman Institute was the most noble and creative experience in education as possible. David Hartman was quite a genius in this, that he knew how to recruit scholars from the Jewish world of scholarship, from the philosophical world, from the legal world of professors, from universities around the world, Princeton, Yale, Oxford, and theological leaders from the Boston School of Theology, from this Harvard School of Theology, from what was it, in Berkeley, the Berkeley School of Theology, great theologians. We had seminars on the issue of Jewish Christian understanding. Eventually, we added Muslims to that. We opened up the Muslim part of that as well. And the issue was, one issue was the guideline for all of it. How do you do Judaism when the Jews don't agree with each other on fundamentals? As an Orthodox Jew, that you're guided by the injunctions, say, of the Talmud. How would the Talmud handle this? The fact that there are Jews that don't believe in the Talmud, they don't believe in divinity, they don't necessarily believe that the Torah is min hashamayim, that the Torah is heavenly, and they think that the Torah is old-fashioned. And yet they live there and they're defending the country, and they have every right to be there as much as you. How are you supposed to understand the attitude of the religion to this new reality? We never had this before in Jewish history, where Jews have power over one another and have to make space for each other when they don't agree on fundamentals. This is the challenge. Was Judaism compatible with democracy? Could the message of Judaism translate into the 20th or 21st century? This was also the project of Menachem Elon, the professor and a jurist in the Supreme Court, who's the famous author of Hamishpat HaIvri, Jewish law, where he argued that the Knesset should really have been using the Talmudic law rather than the Turkish and English law, because people kept saying that the Talmud is anachronistic. But he argued a law will never develop if you don't use it. But the Talmud had shown itself to be very, very usable until the Enlightenment, when you see the responsa of the rabbis under new conditions that were not from the period of the Talmud, but in the Middle Ages, how they used the laws of the Talmud to accommodate to the new situation. I mean, this is a great skill and art, and he believed in it. We believed in it, but we tried to analyze how to do it. Let me give you an example of
Wait,
this.
before you do that, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
How did you get along with the religious authorities in Israel? Because they had great political power.
The answer is, we, among the other things we started to do in Israel, we started an experimental high school within the religious track, Mamlachti Dati. But we offered curriculums in that program that were creative and had to be approved by the Ministry of Education. Eventually, those programs were even copied by the schools. So instead of, for example, studying Talmud, any tractate like, I don't know, Bava Metzia, the people that created the curriculum, that was David Dishon and Chagi Ben Artzi, they created a curriculum that had to do with subjects that were relevant to a modern state. For example, drafting, being drafted into the army. Who's obligated to go to the army? That's a subject in the tractate Sota. We studied a subject about religious tolerance for religions that aren't Jewish. That's a subject in Masechet Avodah Zarah. We studied the subject of tzedakah. What is the responsibility of tzedakah when tzedakah is not a pushka, a box where you collect money for the synagogue fund, or where you're talking about the economic system that has to create employment for a population of 5 million people? How do you do it? What's the fair distribution of resources? economically. Education. What's the responsibility of education when you're not talking just about a Hebrew school or a yeshiva? You're talking about an educational system for a whole country that includes universities, that includes seminaries, that includes non-Jewish education, Arab education. How do you do it? Where are the resources in the rabbinic tradition to help us through this? To this end, the Hartman Institute had a center of philosophy, a center of theology, and they had conferences with great thinkers from all over the world, which mulled over these issues using all kind of resources of literature that we had to discover, to use it creatively to come up with some kind of suggestions. If you see the books that were published by the Hartman Institute, The Jewish Political Tradition, volume 1, 2, and 3, Michael Walzer was the editor of that. And you see the discussion that took place on that issue. It's amazing. Yeshivas never did
so
that.
Tzvi, why this seems like you were in a candy store.
You're not addressing me, right? When you say Tzvi.
I'm sorry, Rabbi Marx.
Yes.
It seems like you were in a kind of almost a candy store of ideas and creativity. Correct. And so on at Hartman.
Correct.
So what caused you to go to the Netherlands? Well,
I had done a doctorate in the Netherlands that came about because of the Joint. The Joint has an office in Yerushalayim, and I was the educational director at the Hartman Institute. So we had been asked by the Joint to create learning materials for health, for professionals, professionals dealing with different subjects: community, the elderly, and the handicapped. So I distributed the subject to some of the colleagues of mine. Some wanted to do the community, some wanted to do this, the senior citizens. No one wanted to do the handicapped. So I decided I'll do the handicapped with my Chavruta Shaya Ben Yehuda. There's no tractate that's called the handicapped in the Talmud. We had to collect material. Eventually, we collected about 90 pages of material on the subject from different parts of the Talmud and the responsa. And I gave a course of 10 weeks to health professionals, government professionals, people dealing with handicapped in different situations in Israel. And when we were finished, I had been, jealous of my younger colleagues who were getting doctorates. And I said, I'd like to get a doctorate also. Why can't I use these 90 pages and start this project? But I needed someone to guide me. I needed a mentor. So someone who worked in our office came from Holland, and she had studied with Rabbi Yehuda Ashkenazi in Holland. He had an institute called the Volkertsma Institute for Talmud that he had founded. He was an Auschwitz survivor. And I got in touch with him. I said, would you be interested in sponsoring me for a doctorate in a Dutch university? He was a professor at university on this subject. He jumped at the chance because he never had a yeshiva colleague. His students were mostly non-Jews. In fact, he created non-Jewish Talmudists, is what he did. It's amazing. He really did, literally, thousands. And so he jumped at it. So eventually, make a long story short, he says, you can only come here if you show me an outline of the chapters you might want to do and you collect the bibliography. It took me a while to get to that because I was working full-time on all kind of educational programs, but I eventually did. And then I asked Rabbi Hartman for a sabbatical. That was in 1991. It was the summer when the Iraqis made war, the first Iraqi war, and they bombed Israel. That was that summer. So David Hartman agreed that I would have a sabbatical a year, and I went to Holland with a stack of papers and material from the database, from the Bar Ilan University database, in which I pulled out anything to do with blind, lame, disadvantaged, mentally disabled, anything I could pay. I had a pile of the original printouts with the little holes in it, if you remember, Bar Ilan. So, and I went to Holland, and Rabbi Yehuda Ashkenazi guided me through my first chapter, which I wrote on tzedakah and the handicap. And I eventually learned how to use a computer on that occasion. And eventually I learned that I don't have to write things by hand. I could write them in the computer. And then I could correct the version and correct the version again and make a second version. And before you know it, I was producing a chapter every 2-3 weeks. By the time February came around, I had like 15 chapters. I said, I have to stop. I want to get a doctorate. How do I round this out? So I did. Make a long story short, I finished it. The doctorate was eventually published as a book by Boston University, and it's called Disability in Jewish Law, or Jewish Law and Disability, as a book. So Yehuda Ashkenazi was getting on in years, and he needed a successor. So I went to Holland and became his successor. That's more or less what happened. So then, you know.
Did you know Dutch then, or how did you?
I went to, what I did was, before I went to Holland, I bought a couple of Dutch books, and I kept practicing Dutch with these books, learning the grammar a little bit. And when I came to Holland, I went to the best language school. That's called it's run by, it was originally founded by nuns. That's why they call it the nun school. But it's the best language school that people use to learn a language quickly. So within 2 weeks, I took 2 weeks of that school. And after those 2 weeks, I started speaking Dutch. And within a month or so, I was giving lectures in Dutch. Someone translated for me some of the texts I wanted from the Talmud. He translated into Dutch for me so I could use it. But what's fortunate in Holland is people know English very well, because they all know English. So what I couldn't say in Dutch, I could still say in English. So it was relatively an easy thing. But I did learn Dutch, and I read books, and now I lecture in Dutch. Everything I do in Holland in terms of teaching is in Dutch, unless I'm talking to you in English.
And so let's talk a little bit about your teaching in Holland. I know that you teach Christian ministers.
Among others, yep.
So how does that work? And how did it get started?
It started with Yehuda Ashkenazi. Yehuda Ashkenazi, he founded this, what they call in Holland, the Lair House. It was actually something started by Franz Rosenzweig in Germany, the Lair House, the study house, the Beit Midrash. But he wanted it for non-Jews. He wanted to do something so that the Holocaust, the Shoah, wouldn't happen again. That meant he wanted the non-Jews to understand what Judaism was. That was his thing. And he developed students. He was a very inspired person. He didn't write much, but his like the Ari HaKadosh from Tzfat, who never wrote very much, but he was able to inspire people, and they wrote. So the same thing happened here. He created this long before I came, and when I came, he put me into the circuit with it. So I also started to teach some of these groups on different subjects. I wanted mostly to teach Talmud, because that was something I liked more than anything else. But eventually, I also had to learn a lot of Bible, because, you know, the Christians, the Protestant Christians, they are into the Bible. That's part of their culture. So if you teach them a Bible text and how you could see it differently than what they see, well, that's tremendous. And so eventually, I was giving courses in Talmud, in different biblical books. And eventually, when he retired, I became the director of that institute, the Volketsma Stichting.
Where was that? Where was that located?
It's in a city called Hilversum. And Hilversum is the city where the television and the radio stations are located. So it's an important city. It's about a half hour from Amsterdam by train. So that was in Hilversum. And Hilversum was about, I don't know, an hour and 10 minutes from where I lived. I'd go by train to Hilversum. At the same time, I started teaching in the university, in Radboud University, which is in the city of Nijmegen. They have a religious studies program. So all the students had to do something like 6 weeks of a course of Judaism. So I taught many students in the course of the years. And there was also a college in Utrecht and in Zwolle. These are cities where I also taught. So in the course of the years, I taught many students in the university or colleges, but I continued to teach these Lair houses. And I gave individual lectures as well, wrote articles at times that were published in different publications. of the country. And of course, the question is, why would these Christians want to study Judaism? The Dutch Christians. What's their motivation? I thought you would ask me that, so I'm asking it to myself.
Yes. Yeah.
Just,
Go ahead.
That's a good question, right? So I once wrote a kind of an article. I gave a talk on it, which I still have to remind myself. And it goes something like this. First of all, why do they want to study Judaism? Well, they want to understand the Jewish roots of their own religion. After all, Jesus was a Jew. In fact, he was even an Orthodox Jew. That's a surprise to many of them. That they didn't realize. They knew he was a Jew, but never occurred to them he was actually a Pharisee. There's a professor, Usher Finkel, who was also a student of Yeshiva University, student of Soloveitchik, and also the Hasidic dynasties. He got a doctorate in Tübingen. And the doctorate, the book was published as a book. It's called, in 1973, it's called The Teacher from Nazareth, which is about Jesus. And his whole book is to show that Jesus was a Pharisee. And the footnotes are longer than the actual text to make his point. So he had tzitzis, he kept Pesach, he kept Shabbos, etc., etc. Well, just humoristically, one time some group asked me, well, can you tell us about how Jews think about Jesus? So I asked them, well, do you want the truth or you want me to tell you a nice story that you could, feel good about? No, we want the truth. I said, here's the truth. Supposing, as you believe it, Jesus is coming back for the second coming. And he comes to you and he says, oh my God, I am so hungry. I'd love to have a delicious steak. I haven't had that for a long time. Who here is going to invite him to have a steak? Everybody raised their hand. I said, but unfortunately, he can't eat in your house because you're not kosher. He can only eat in my house. I have a kosher kitchen. What? And then, secondly, you're going to say, oh, please, Master Jesus, Lord, come to our church service on Sunday. And he's going to say to you, church service on Sunday? I have to go to shul. I have to hear Kriyas HaTorah. I have to hear the Torah. You realize what it means when you say that Jesus is a Jew and an Orthodox Jew? Never occurred to them. They knew mythically he's a Jew, but never occurred to them.
But there was the whole business with the Dead Sea Scrolls and how Jesus was from that sect, and that was a big deal. And
this is all. You know what this is all about? This is all about the attempt to Christianize Jesus, as it were. If you read Fredrickson, she wrote a book called From Jesus to Christ, how the Christians kidnapped this Jewish kid and turned him into Christ. And of course, it's part of the, at that time, the attempt to replace the Jews as the true Israel. But the Christians are over that reality now because Israel exists. They all acknowledge that we are the true Israel. And so, of course, they have an identity problem. Who are they? If we are the real Israel, then what are they then? And then they have a difficult time now to find their way to their own identity. That's a long story. In the meantime, they want to understand, how do Jews read the Bible? So they would ask me, how do Jews read the Bible? I said to some of them, you know what? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to let you experience it. Tell you what we're going to do. Let's pick a text. So we pick any text, a chapter, anything you want in the 5 books of Moses, in Song of Songs, whatever you like. They pick a chapter. I said, okay, now what we're going to do is, everybody has read the chapter. Everybody has to raise a question about the chapter, something that disturbed them, something that wasn't clear, something that was inconsequential. And we're going to listen to all the questions. Nobody gives any answers, okay? So we make a round. Everybody asks a question. I make sure that the questions are understood. After the first round, there's a lot of tension because, when there are questions in the air with a group, somebody wants to answer. You have to hold them back. You know what? We're going to do a second round. Again, a question. 2 sets. Let's say you have 15 people in a group. It's 30 questions, okay? Then I say, okay, now whoever wants to answer any question, you have the floor. So someone finally says, so-and-so asked this question. I don't understand why it's a problem. After all, it says so-and-so in the text. So I asked the person who asked the question, are you satisfied with his answer? He said, no, I'm not satisfied because he doesn't take account of this and this. So I say, how would you answer his objection? She said, well, after all, and if anybody else wants to contribute, just jump in. Before you know it, people are arguing with each other about the text that they thought were very, very clear. I let this go on for about a half hour. Then I say to them, I have a question for you. Through this activity, did this text become more clear or less clear to you? So they say it became less clear. I said, that's how Jews study the Bible. That's how we study. That's why I said, in our Bible, you never have just the text. You have all kind of commentaries, the Mikraot Gedolot, the great scriptures, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, the Sforno, Yosef Kara, the Minchas Shai. We have all kind of questions that we have. We're never finished with it. The whole Jewish experience is about questions. Yeah.
I have a question for you because we're basically out of time.
Oh.
I want to ask you, what are you going to do from now? You're 80 years old. What does the future hold for Rabbi Marx?
Well, let's put it this way. When I look at Moses, he began his third career at the age of 80. So I have no problem. People ask me, are you retiring? No, I said, I'm still teaching. I have 6 study groups right now. I teach Talmud, Ta'anit. Someone translated 2 volumes of the Talmud into Dutch. I use them. So I'm teaching the tractate Ta'anit as an example of crises, how people respond to crises like the COVID-19. But here it's in the time of the rain fell short, or there was in this 3rd chapter, you get into diseases happened, drought or mildew, or wolves are eating children. How do you respond to crisis? I'm teaching that group. Then I have a group that learns the Exodus with Rashi. In the early 20th century, Rabbi Underweiser translated Rashi into Dutch. So we have these books, so I could use them. Then I have a course that I'm teaching to 2-3 groups, Yecheskel, the prophet Yecheskel. I never taught Yecheskel before. So he's a transitional prophet. So it's very interesting to see the prophet that lived before the destruction of the temple, during the destruction of the temple, and after the destruction. What was his message to the people that were still in Jerusalem before and to the people in Babylon after? When you look at it from that perspective, the prophet Yecheskel becomes very interesting. So we study that. Then I have a group that's studying the Parshat HaShavua for themes that come out of themes. So I'm still working. My work is not done. This is my hobby and my work, and I get paid for it also on top of it. So why should I retire? Why should I retire?
Don't. We love it.
Who pays you? The people that are studying. A Lair House has a cost to it. Say, if I give a course in Arnhem, by the way, this Lair House exists 55 years already, continuously. I wasn't the one to start it, but I'm learning with them. So they pay me. Usually a session is 2 hours. So when I come away, so they're paying me something like 220 euros per session, for example. Okay, plus train costs. An example. A person comes to the other course, so they pay for the course themselves 160 for 7 meetings. But I'm getting paid whatever, 200, 300, 400 euros for a session. Depends on the group, depends on the year. This year was difficult because of the COVID business. We even did courses in Zoom for the last 2 years because people couldn't travel. Now we're going back to live activities. So the point is the motivation is there, and the prickle is something that I provide. I have to admit, I'm not your typical Dutch rabbi. I'm not. I really am not. And that's exactly why I have customers. It really is the case. But I don't see myself retiring. I have enough energy. And so your question about age.
Do you ever give talks outside of or lectures or outside of the Netherlands?
Outside the Netherlands, I've done that also. Yes, I have. First of all, I came many years to Washington, where Robert is. I was a rabbi there for like 32 years in the High Holy Day period. I gave many lectures there, and I never gave the same lecture twice. I had to give approximately 10 lectures every time I came. I'm pretty clear about that. I at least consciously, I never gave the same lecture twice.
That's
Even when I had to do
320
downstairs and
different
upstairs.
lectures.
What?
That's 320 different lectures.
That's correct. But on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, for that period. Yeah, that's correct. That's what it is. Sometimes I think I should write them up, but I didn't write them up. There were more outlines. And then, because I believe in the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral presentation, because you are prickled by the audience that's in front of you. You can't always prepare in advance how are you going to feel when you give a lecture. And I like to keep that open. So I allow myself that prickle. So and suddenly, how are you going to open the lecture? That depends, depends who's asking and depends how I feel at the moment, which means I can't publish it easily. When these people that they write their paper and then they read them. So if you're going to read the paper, you don't have to speak it to me.
Well, you have a blog. You can put it in your blog.
But then that's true, I could, but I'm doing it in Dutch. I give most of these lectures in Dutch now. So who's going to read it in Dutch? Only Dutch people. There are such things. They have that also. I listen to it. And Bob has been encouraging me over the years to do something about it, but somehow I never got around to it. Maybe I have time. I'm only 80, so I have 40 years to work on it. By the way, when somebody gets to be 120, usually you say, he's 120. What do you say to him on that day?
You say 120 is the new 80 or something like that.
No. What you say is, have a nice day.
Well, you know that the oldest living human being on record lived to 122.
Really?
Yes.
Where?
French woman, Jean Calment.
Jean Calment. Oh, that's interesting. Now tell me, where will this podcast be? Where will it be located?
It will be on our website called ideasandlives.org, and it will also be a podcast where people can just listen and not view it.
And they can see it on YouTube.
They can see it on YouTube.
What do they have to look in? Tzvi Marx or something?
We'll
give you the link.
Okay.
Our listeners will know that you go to ideasandlives.org, www.ideasandlives.org, and then you go to episodes, and you'll see all of our episodes.
You'll see a picture, a photo of yourself.
Okay. Fine. Great.
Well, thanks very much. How Rabbi Marx, we end it with
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Thank you. You too. Thank you for the opportunity. It was really a pleasure to share this with you. Tell you a little bit